Welcome everybody to this plenary opening discussion that sets the scene for this symposium on humanistic Buddhism. My name's Gawaine Powell-Davies, and it's my pleasure and privilege to be hosting this session where we will discuss the themes of the conference with Hugh Mackay, who is a very well-known Australian social researcher and author, and Professor Lancaster, who's a world authority on Buddhist scholarship and is also a strong figure in the background at Nantian Institute. And when I was thinking of both of them earlier today, I thought they're people who, when they speak, people listen. So we will look forward to listening to them. I'd first of all like to echo my almost namesake's excellent acknowledgement of country and pay my respects to Aboriginal elders past, present and emerging, and offer the reflection that of all the people in Australia, they are the ones with the deepest experience of crisis of all of us. And I hope that through this symposium and at other times, we will learn from their deep and often painful experience. The way this session is going to be run is that for about 45 minutes, I will put a series of questions to our two speakers, and they will have about 8 minutes or so to respond to that particular topic. And then we will move on to the next. After 45 minutes, it will be open to questions from you in the audience. If you want to ask a question, please put it in the chat, and please don't use the chat for any other purposes, otherwise the questions may get lost. If you wish, you may also put your name next to your question, and again, if you wish, where you are asking from. And then the questions will be selected and will be put to our two speakers. The perspective on crisis that I would like to offer as the starting frame for this discussion is that a crisis is when our normal ways of doing business no longer work for one reason or another. And we're left facing difficult circumstances without familiar ways of dealing with them. And these are obviously moments of opportunity to find new ways to respond, but also moments of danger. And I think our theme of never waste a crisis is really about how do we take the opportunities and how do we deal with the dangers. And as we talk about this, I would invite you to remember that in all societies, there are many people for whom business as usual never worked. And one of the questions we might wish to look at is, what can we learn from those people for whom business as usual never worked anyway? And how can we make sure that they are also part of the way that we respond to this crisis? So one more comment about the process. At the end, when we have had all the questions, you will be invited to stay on for a quick photo. And then there will be an online questionnaire that we will invite you to respond to very, very quickly, just to give some immediate feedback on the session that you have heard. So now to our matter. And the first question, all the questions will be addressed by both speakers, but we'll start with Hugh Mackay. And the question is, the COVID crisis has affected us as individuals and also challenged community and society. What has it shown about the balance between isolation and community strength?
Yes, thank you, Gawaine, and hello, everybody, wherever you happen to be. The COVID pandemic has done what crises and catastrophes always do. It's not as though this is a unique event. whether it's a war or an economic depression or a flood or a fire or some local or national crisis. What we notice always is after the initial period of fear and panic, when some people behave very badly, very antisocially, very self-centeredly in response to the crisis, almost always what happens to humans is that in the crisis, as we start dealing with the crisis or the catastrophe, our sense of ourselves as unique, independent individuals tends to recede in favor of our sense of ourselves as coexisting with each other, existing in a state of, as if we're all part of a kind of shimmering, vibrating web of interconnectedness and interdependency. In other words, to put it at its simplest, it sometimes does take a crisis to remind us of the most fundamental truth about what it means to be human, which is that we belong to a social species. There are many other social species on the planet, but we are one of them. And what that means is that we humans are hopeless in isolation. We need each other. We need families, neighborhoods, groups, communities of all kinds to nurture us and sustain us, and to give us that all-important sense of belonging, which is so fundamental to the health and well-being of a member of a social species. So what the crisis does, what this crisis, like all others, has done, is to remind us of that, to cause us perhaps to lose a bit of the edgy obsession that we had with how special I am, how different I am, look at my identity, look how I'm different from everyone else, in favor of, wow, we're all in this together. And what emerges when we have a sense of being in this together is a reversion to our true nature as humans, being kinder, being more compassionate, being more mutually respective, being prepared to make sacrifices in the interests of the common good. Now, these are all expressions of what Abraham Lincoln described as the better angels of our nature. And it's a sad reality about humans that we can be distracted from all of that by ego-driven impulses, by the sense of the individual self as the critical thing. But generally speaking, in this kind, right now we're seeing it in Australia, in countries all around the world, a reminder, in effect, a reminder of what it actually means to be human, how we do need each other. And as part of that, I'll just add one more thing before Lou speaks on the same topic, but it's a reminder of the fact, and you hinted at this, I think, Gawaine, that not just in a crisis, but all the time, there are people in our midst who are experiencing some of the difficulties that we experience in a crisis. And in particular, the one I'd focus on initially while I'm talking about the concept of what it means to belong to a social species. In particular, I'd refer to those people who are permanently at risk of social isolation, either because of their age or their frailty or their disability or some other circumstance they find themselves in. They are the people for whom the rest of us need to be reminded from time to time that they are part of us and that we bear a responsibility to include them in our life, whether it's the life of our street or our apartment block or our nation, whatever it is, because another thing that we're reminded of during a pandemic, particularly when we lived through a lockdown experience, as most of us have, at least for a while, is that social isolation doesn't agree with us. But when you're a member of a social species, if you, like a herd animal, if you're cut off from the herd, you suffer. And what do you suffer? Well, we know what you suffer because we see people around the world, particularly the Western world, suffering loneliness, anxiety, depression, the obvious consequences of members of a social species who've been isolated through their own life's experience or through this crisis. So just to wrap all that up in one simple thought, I guess what I'm saying is a crisis is a potential blessing because it reminds us of something we can too easily forget about what it actually means to be human.
You, Lou.
I am reminded of what the word compassion means. Sometimes we have given the word passion so many meanings, but in its real meaning, I think for us, compassion is suffering together. We forget that passion comes from the Latin root for suffering. We think of it as a passionate plea or something, an enthusiastic plea. But we are fellow sufferers. The Buddhists say we have three great messengers: illness, old age, and death. And they are sent to us to remind us that we suffer together. We all have the same suffering in that sense. And it has nothing to do with political boundaries, social or ethical behavior. We are all sufferers and brothers and sisters, if you will, in these issues. And I think what you've said, Hugh, is that it takes something sometimes to remind us of this. We forget this so easily. We just have to go to sleep tonight and wake up tomorrow morning and we've forgotten it again, and we have to be constantly reminded of it. Thank you.
So crises remind us who we are. They also sometimes challenge social norms in ways that are not always comfortable. How does that play out in a crisis? Do we find social norms held onto and reinforced because they are something we're familiar with, or do we find that they change and adapt to the circumstances we find ourselves in? Lou, maybe you first up this time.
I think none of us were ready for COVID. I don't think we were ready to see our streets emptied of cars because of lockdown. Here, I'm staying in Los Angeles at the moment. I never thought that I would see an empty freeway. It was really startling to me. We weren't prepared for this. We had no idea when it came upon us how long it was going to last. As Hugh has said, we weren't prepared for the isolation it brought. That we had to stay home and we had to wear masks and we couldn't go in shops and we couldn't go to school and we couldn't do travel. And it was something we were not prepared for. It made me think, though, about, I've been doing prison visitation for many years. And when I first went into the prisons, these men that I was visiting had experienced this breakdown that you're talking about, Gawaine, more than anybody I've ever met in my life. They had lost their prestige, their money, often their families, their sense of worth, their clothes, all possessions. And when I first walked into a room of people who were faced with this level of disassociation from life as we know it, I realized I need to learn from these people what it's like. I don't know what that's like. But yet during the COVID lockdown, all of us, in a sense, began to have to face some things which were similar to what those prisoners faced. Mm. We were just locked down. And that's a term for prison. And I think that what has inspired me from that is to see that those prisoners who have begun to practice meditation and begun to really try to deal with this crisis, they can do it, they do it, and the changes that are affected by their attempts are huge because they have so far to go. So when people say, I hear you go to prison, and I say, in a sense, yes, I go to prison to learn. Because there's nobody else that I know who can teach me about what it's like to be totally separated from everything you know, from everything you treasure. And yet to be able to survive that, I need to hear that. I don't know, Hugh, if you have some similar experiences, but that's been one of my major experiences with this kind of thing.
Yes, thanks, Lou. I must say I haven't been involved in prisoner visitation, but I have reflected quite a lot through the pandemic on the fact that the worst punishment in Australia, the worst punishment we can inflict on a prisoner in our criminal justice system is solitary confinement. And I think that's a very significant commentary in a way, or expression of the fact that our common humanity our sense of our common humanity is placed at risk when we are socially isolated, and it's a dreadful form of punishment to inflict on someone, that they would be a herd animal separated from the herd. Now, imprisonment does that in any case, but solitary confinement within the prison system exaggerates that problem. But back to the question of the social norms, etc., that Gawaine referred to, I'd like to add a slightly different dimension to the conversation on this as well. Some negative and some positive. The negative is that we noticed during the pandemic in Australia and in other societies, but I'll talk about Australia, which is where my experience is based. We noticed some of the ugliest aspects of our society exaggerated. Things like ageism. The pandemic was initially jocularly referred to as the boomer remover. In other words, let's kill off the baby boomers, get them off the stage. Well, that was jocular in a way, but it was an expression of a very deep prejudice we'll call ageism, which is lurking in our society and does come out. Racism came out in some very ugly ways in Australia early in the pandemic. Many people of Asian appearance in Australia reported that they were the victims of even more vile racist abuse than they might normally have had to deal with, because they were somehow being associated with or even blamed for the fact that the pandemic had arrived in Australia. We've also seen that the pandemic has had a far more harsh economic impact on people who are already economically disadvantaged. So if you were dealing with part-time casual employment, living a life of economic insecurity, it became far worse during the pandemic. So there were some, we'll call them social norms, social phenomena, ugly ones, dark ones in our society that have been somewhat exaggerated. But the other dimension I'd add to this, and I hope this makes some sense, but it seems to me that the pandemic has challenged a number of other social norms that we'd kind of learned to live with, and we have to learn to live with them. I'm talking about social trends that have been reshaping our society for 30 or 40 years, pushing us in a particular direction, which is the direction of social fragmentation, being a more atomized kind of society, a much higher incidence of social isolation, some loss of social cohesion, and so on. I'll mention the sort of things that illustrate that briefly in a moment. But it does seem to me that those things have become normalized, and they've pushed us in the direction of rampant individualism. Now, my question is, has the pandemic been enough of a shock? Have we had enough of a disruption to shock us into realizing that we've been perhaps rather blindly allowing ourselves to be pushed in the direction of becoming more fragmented, as though that's the norm? And just very quickly, let me say a couple of examples of what I mean by this. Our shrinking households. The fastest growing household type in Australia and in the US and in many other societies is the single person household. We've normalized the solo householder as a mainstream phenomenon. Now, there's nothing wrong with that, of course, and plenty of people who live alone love living alone and see it as a symbol of freedom and independence, but not everyone enjoys it. Some people are living alone through force of circumstance, like bereavement, relationship breakdown, etc., and don't like it. But whatever the situation is, a society like Australia that is now every fourth household, and within the next 10 years, that'll be every third household, contains just one person. We have normalized solo living in a way that puts social cohesion at greater risk. It doesn't mean that all those people are socially isolated, but it does mean the risk of social isolation is greatly increased. The fact that we have such a high sustained rate of relationship breakdown in Australia, between 35 and 40% of contemporary marriages will end in divorce. That's now normalized. That's one of our social norms. And there's nothing wrong with that. No one who's divorced wishes to get remarried, in my experience, or remarried to the same person, in my experience. But when we normalize that, then we learn to live with another major contributor to social fragmentation and the disruption of social cohesion. Similarly, our enthusiastic embrace of busyness. In Australia, we now greet each other as though busyness is the norm. We say, how are you going, Gawaine? Busy? As though, come on, are you busy or are you dead? There are only two options. We've normalized busyness. Busyness is the enemy of social cohesion. Busyness is all about preoccupation, living in a bubble of activity, and sacrificing precious time where you could be connecting. We've normalized, and of course our symposium today is an example of how brilliant the technology is, but we've normalized our embrace of information technology at the expense of face-to-face interaction. Now, that's another norm. So what I'm suggesting is all these norms, to use your word, even our low birth rate, I mean, we're way below replacement level, and I think that's another fragmenting phenomenon, because kids typically act as a social lubricant in local neighbourhoods. Well, in Australia and in Western Europe, even more than in Australia, we're producing the smallest generation of kids relative to total population, smallest generation we've ever produced. That social lubricant is in shorter supply. We've normalised the low birth rate. We've normalised childlessness or the single child families. Again, nothing wrong with any of that. We just have to recognise what its potential impact is on our sense of our common humanity, on our sense of needing healthy, viable, creative, flourishing communities to sustain us. So what I'm hoping, there's a long way around to get to this point, but what I'm hoping is that the pandemic will remind us that we've been drifting in a direction which is not healthy for us. We can't stop those trends. We can't even decelerate those trends, but we can be far more alert to the potential damage they can do to social cohesion.
So, Hugh, continuing with you, if I may, and thinking about the opportunity as well as the danger side of the ledger when we talk about crises. Obviously, the issues that you've raised are points at which we could choose to move or respond differently. But are there other doors for change or development that the crisis has opened up for us that you hope that we might be able to take up, follow through?
There are, and I'll be brief on this because I went on too long just then, and I apologise for that. There are indeed. I think we've been sharply reminded of the importance of the local neighbourhood. We've been far more alert under the influence of the pandemic to the possibility that that old guy at the end of the street might be socially isolated. Maybe we'd better go and say hello. And I mean, I heard a lovely story about a couple of young men, one in Sydney, one in Melbourne, who'd moved into new accommodation just before the first national lockdown in Australia. So there they were stranded. They didn't know anyone. What was their response? The response, they didn't know each other. It was coincidental. Each of them wrote a little note saying, I'm new to the street, I don't know anyone here, but here's my phone number. If you need anything, you need someone to mow your lawn or pick up a prescription from the chemist or do your shopping, give us a call. And they put those little notes in the letterboxes of the people in their street. Now, the question is, would they have done that if they'd moved into their new accommodation and there had not been a pandemic and a lockdown? Answer, almost certainly not. Yeah. It was an opportunity to reach out to the local neighbourhood that was kind of created for them, almost forced on them by the fact that they were living through the pandemic. A lot of people have learned through the experience of working at home that you can work very productively at home and you need contact with colleagues as well. A lot of managers learned from trying to manage their work groups online that people who were socially isolated often were suffering feelings of anxiety and isolation and loneliness and so on. And they saw the need for more pastoral attention to the people they were managing. Now, the question is, would that, like with the young men who might move into another neighbourhood and do what they did then, even if there isn't a pandemic, will managers now going back to a more normal way of working, will they remember that the pastoral dimension of management is always crucial? It was made obvious at that time. When we realise how brilliantly and efficiently information technology has connected us, we have also realised, here's another opportunity, we've also realised what a dreadful second best it really is. We can't wait to go and hug people. We can't wait to go and make eye contact with the people that we love, the people we, our friends, our colleagues, etc., even our neighbours. Yes, I think in all these ways, the disruption to our way of life, virtually all those disruptions are reminders. They're teachers, to use Lou's earlier expression. They are reminding us that those lessons are lessons we should not let go of. We should internalize, cling to, and generalize.
Lou, what doors do you hope we will keep open as we move out of this crisis, and innovations that we will keep, directions that we will move in?
Thank you. I'm thinking of in 1918, we had another pandemic, the so-called Spanish flu, which wasn't Spanish at all, but by chance got named the Spanish flu, killed millions of people. And I have kind of identified with it, even though it happened before my time, because my mother was being trained as a nurse in Philadelphia, which was one of the centers of that pandemic. And it killed young people. It was not, as Hugh has talked about, this one where it's people over 65 have constituted more than 80% of the deaths from COVID. In the 1918, it was the opposite. Over 80% of the deaths were people from the age of 25 to 40. It was a young people's disease. But you know, after the 1918 pandemic had subsided and herd immunity began to take place, people absolutely forgot it. They didn't talk about it. It was not part of novels anymore. You didn't find it in movies. They didn't make movies about the 1918 flu epidemic. It was just forgotten. Everybody wanted to get back to their old ways. And I fear that that is a potential for us today. What we really want is to go back to the way things were before COVID. And it's never going to be possible. It's never going to be possible. So I've kind of experienced this in my life. I take a walk every day in the neighborhood, which before COVID was very anonymous. Nobody knew anybody as far as I could tell. You only knew your neighbor if they were famous. And otherwise, nobody knew who anybody was. But here I was, an old man with my cane, and every day I walked the same streets because there's only so many that I can get access to. And after a while, people began to come out of their houses and come out into the street and talk to me. Never had that happen to me before. And pretty soon, I know almost everybody along the street now. Not only did I meet them, but they came out and poured out their stories to me. I know a lot about them. And where I live is in Pacific Palisades, which is in Los Angeles. And some are movie stars, TV stars. Many of them are really rich people. And they were all coming out and sharing. Now, when the pandemic has eased, when I take a walk, there's nobody again. They're all in their cars and going to work. They have just disappeared from the scene. and I walk alone on the street, and I think this is what it was like before COVID.
Mm.
And it's so easy to just fall back into the old pattern. Not only easy, it's what we wish and we want. And we aren't ready to look, as you've suggested, we aren't ready to look for the new doors that are open to us, which we should do. We should have listened to the 1918 epidemic. The city of Philadelphia decided to celebrate the end of World War I, and they had a big parade, and the doctors begged them, and they said, no, don't do it because you're going to spread this flu. But they did it anyway. And within weeks, 12,000 people died.
Mm.
But we didn't learn that lesson. We had to learn it all over again.
So just building on that, Lou, we don't have much recovery time before the next crisis starts to really bite. And of course, that's the climate and ecological crises that we face. So what are the implications of our COVID experience, or what can we take from it into the way we understand and respond to the climate crises?
I look at World War II. World War II was one of the most successful transdisciplinary events in history. World War II was a time when no matter who you were, what your gender, what your social status, you were asked to participate. And in World War II, people from all walks of life were put together: physicists, chemists, doctors, lawyers, everybody, women, even children. And it worked. We killed millions of people. We leveled cities all over Europe and parts of Asia. It was very successful. We filled the floors of the ocean with sunken ships. If we could simply take that as a message, that for any of these huge issues like climate change, it can't be done by a few people. It can't be done by a few disciplines. We can't make a discipline, ecology, and say that's going to solve that. It's going to take something comparable to World War II, where every possible person that can offer anything needs to be activated and made use of, because it has to do with how we cook our food, how we drive our cars, how we manage our lives on a day-to-day basis that is making the situation worse. So how do we change that? So number one, don't forget COVID. And number two, we need to all be involved and forget this kind of thing of saying, I'm going to identify a specific group and tell them, here, it's your problem, you solve it. Thank you.
Thank you. And Hugh, what would you add to that?
Yes, just before I add something to that, I just want to reflect. I mean, there's a really important and really dark message in what Lou has been saying about our propensity to try and shed these things once we're through them and kind of forget they ever happened. An exception to that in Australian history certainly was the Great Depression. There was a whole generation of Australians who'd been raising young families during the Great Depression who said, and I often encountered them in my research, Those lessons never left us. We got our priorities straight. We embraced certain values. We became famous for our frugality. We'd never throw out a piece of string, and we were the people who'd always bake a cake when a new neighbour moved into the street and so on. Younger generations don't do that. So there's just a glimmer of hope for me in that. There was a particular, it was different from the crises we've been talking about. It was long and it was not life-threatening, which may have been to its advantage, I suppose, in the sense that people, under the influence of that prolonged depression, learned to live differently, and those patterns stuck. So I'm not entirely pessimistic, but this was a life-threatening one, so we may be tempted to shed it. But I absolutely echo what Lou said about the need to be on a war footing if we are actually going to take the lessons of COVID. I mean, some very smart people have been saying, think of COVID as a dress rehearsal for how we're going to have to respond to not just the looming, but the immediate obvious impact of climate change, which is going to get greater. This is just a dry run. This is grotesque and awful though it's been. It's as nothing compared with the global threat that will be posed by the impact of climate change. So yes, a war footing, and I think a difference between World War II and our response to climate change is that we can't look to governments. I mean, governments start wars and prosecute wars and vote budgets to increase armaments and all those sort of things. This one is all in, we're all in this. And I think it's very significant, even coming out of the Glasgow conference of this very week, that some of the major initiatives around the world, and certainly including Australia, are being taken by corporations rather than governments, mining companies, oil companies, banks, insurance companies, changing policies in ways that are going to force quite fundamental, quite seismic shifts in the way economies operate and in the way energy is generated and consumed. And that goes all the way down to every last individual householder, citizen, who can make some contribution to the mitigation of these effects. I think this is one of those cases where we need a revolutionary approach. We need to take, as Lou has said, let's remember what COVID taught us, that we are, well, essentially we are all one. And we've got to be thinking of our response to the threat from climate change as if we are all one. There can be no exceptions. But let's not assume that the revolution, because that's what's required, will start from the top. The sort of revolutions that transform a society never start from the top. It really does involve all of us, and not just acting differently, but insisting that our corporate, the institutions that are like the scaffolding of our society change the way they think, the way they behave, and insisting that the members of parliament, the people we elect as members of our parliaments, will be totally alert to this and will be not needing to be persuaded, but will be absolutely on board with the idea that every decision we make from now on has to take into account the fact of climate change and the corresponding fact that you can't separate Lou or Gawaine or Hugh from each other. We are part of a greater whole called humanity, and this response calls for humanity.
So just the last question for this bracket, and just building on that, Hugh, how do we remember that we are one when we have such different histories and experiences and allegiances, and where there are groups who have a vested interest in us not remembering that we are one.
Mm.
So how do we maintain that?
Yes. It's a huge challenge, of course, because as you say, I mean, vested interests, pressure groups, minorities, groups of all kinds want to push separateness, want to push specialness, uniqueness. I mean, we're living through, in a sense, we're living through the age of identity, where from the individual to political groups and others, there's what I described earlier as an obsession with identity. Now, identity is important, but compared with our sense of our shared humanity, identity is trivial. And we've got to start saying that out loud. We've got to start saying, yes, I respect your differences, but I want to tell you there's something even more important than that. Mm-hmm. You are human. You know, you're a man or a woman or something in between. Yeah, that's fascinating to you. But the most important thing about you is you are a human person. You're rich, you're poor, you're advantaged, you're disadvantaged. You speak French, Italian, Vietnamese, English. Yep, fascinating. Trivial compared with the fact that you're human. We've just got to keep saying that. The most important thing about me is that I'm a human being. And once I've admitted that, then there's no escape from the next step in the argument, which is, oh, I belong to this human species. That imposes on me a biological obligation to ensure the survival of this species. And that biological obligation translates into a moral obligation, as most moral obligations do have their roots in human biology.
And Lou, what would you add to that?
Oh, I agree with what Hugh has said, and he said it very, very beautifully. We are humans. We don't. And yet, at the same moment, one of the things that we have to also learn is that this earth of ours does not belong to us. Mm. It is not just a human earth. We could not survive just if we make the whole world only populated with humans. We'll all die. This world of ours is made up of animals, bugs, insects, birds, whales, fish. And so we have to be careful not to become so human-oriented, if you will, that we forget that we are, at the same time, if I may suggest this to you, we are animals. Mm. And we share this globe with a lot of other animals. And part of the life that we live is that we can live together with animals and do it with great benefit to all of us. Thank you.
Thank you both. Now we will open up for questions from the audience. If you have a question, go to the chat, put it in. As they say on Q&A, keep it short, keep it nice. And if you would like to put your name and where you are, feel free to. And then selected questions will come out. And the first one is from Jonathan Page, who says that he has learnt from his indigenous kin that they see themselves as totally connected to the natural world around them. Their identity is an ecosystem. We seem to be forgetting today our interconnection with the other species of the biosphere. How should we acknowledge and work with the whole world of Gaia and tap into indigenous wisdom? And I think, Lou, that is really building on what you were just saying about recognizing that this is not just a human world, Is there anything that you would like to add? And particularly perhaps about how we may learn better from our Indigenous colleagues?
Well, you in Australia are at least trying to recognize your Indigenous colleagues, share the land with you. I greatly fear that I come from a time and my ancestors came and the issue was to pay no attention to them, to even kill them, to remove them, get rid of them. It's very, very hard to open up a compassionate world. The Dalai Lama said it so well. He said, you can't have compassion except between equals. There is no other compassion. So I think this is something which we really, really have to work at. Whether it's the Aboriginal peoples of any land or area in the world, or whether it's our own ethnic heritage, if it's a question of who got here first, who got here second, and we fight and struggle over these issues. But basically, the issue before us is how in the world can we become so sensitized to the way things really are that we will begin to understand we cannot do any act without a consequence. And sometimes that consequence is very destructive, even when we don't intend it to be destructive. So we have to become very, very aware. And I think that's part of what the Buddhists talk about when they say we need to have a focus. We need to be able to concentrate. We need to be able to see ourselves as we really are, if we possibly can, or as close to as possible, and begin to base our acts on that understanding that comes from the awareness of the nature of the world, the animals, the humans, the weather, the monsoons, the rain, the sun. It's an enormous, enormous task.
You.
Yes, thanks, Gawaine. And of course, I totally support and underline, emphasize, reinforce everything that Lou has just been saying. I'll just add perhaps one other little thought, and it's a very little thought, because we're talking here about a vast challenge. We're talking about Gaia. We're talking about the ecosystem. We're talking about our place in the solar system and all of that, which is vital to our true understanding of common humanity, for a start. However, I think it's important also to emphasize that we can get lost in the largeness of these issues and forget that the process of fundamental, radical, revolutionary change, particularly in the direction of being more environmentally responsible, but equally in the direction of being more compassionate, being more fully human, is an entirely personal and individual thing. It's how I respond to the people next door. It's how I behave in my apartment block. It's how I behave in this street or this suburb or this town. It's how I encourage my children or my grandchildren in the direction of kindness or compassion consciousness, as well as environmental consciousness? It seems to me always in parallel, we have to be thinking of the huge challenge that we face and the tiny, personal, step-by-step, individual challenge of acting differently ourselves. I mean, it's a favourite pastime of people in Western democracies to wring their hands about the state of the nation and the state of politics and all that stuff. Now, I don't think we are entitled to wring our hands about the state of the nation until we are confident that we are living as well as we can, until we are contributing to a revolutionary spirit of kindness and compassion and environmental sensitivity. If we're full throttle heading in the right direction personally, then okay, we're qualified to say, wow, look at these other problems that need to be addressed on a national scale. But don't talk about more compassionate government or more environmental sensitivity in high places until we ourselves are doing it.
So I just want to extract something from a rather long question by Yi Tzu Chan, which follows on from this a bit. And that is essentially about how we can incorporate the perspectives and the wisdom of the disadvantaged and the socially isolated and the people who are not usually heard in these processes that we are talking about. And as I raise this, I think about how slow we have been to learn about fire management from Indigenous people who have been expert in that area for thousands of years. And we still blunder around trying to work out if we can trust them. So how do we open and incorporate these people whose understanding is perhaps different, whose worldview is perhaps different, and who we're perhaps not used to listening to?
Lou, do you want to speak first to this?
Yeah, well, I understand this question. Just yesterday, I saw an ad for a movie which said a snowflake in an avalanche does not feel that it's responsible for the avalanche. That we're just snowflakes in an avalanche, and we say, well, it's too big. That's something beyond my level of control. I have no control over this. And as Hugh says, I think that the best thing that I can say for anybody is if you want to make change, start small. Start small. If you say, I'm going to change everything and make it perfect tomorrow, I guarantee you that nothing will probably happen. So essentially, I have to start small. I have a little pattern that I use. I don't recommend it necessarily, but I take a vow every morning that today I vow I will do X. And sometimes it's very ordinary. I am ashamed to even tell you what some of my vows are. But I think that if we can somehow communicate to people that you can do this by starting small, but it has to be cumulative then. It can be small, but it has to be constant. And you have to be continually doing these things for them to accumulate big enough then to make some of the changes that we want. So that's just a thought of how you do it.
Yes, thanks, Gawaine. I'd just add to that another thought, which is that we talk about, I mean, the question included, how do we listen to people who are disadvantaged, poor, marginalised, etc., as well as Indigenous and other groups? I think we have to reframe this. It's very easy to talk about the poor or the marginalised or the disadvantaged. That's us. The frame that we need is to say, we are poor, we are marginalised, we are disadvantaged, some of us. We are Indigenous, some of us. And break down this idea that I'm here and over there are some poor people. No, we are here and some of us are poor. It's a favourite question to ask in societies as unequal as the US and Australia and some others, to say, how come there are so many poor people? Well, a much better question to ask is, how come there are so many rich people? Because that's actually the bigger problem. That's the people who have not understood that we really are in this thing together, and that poverty is not some perpetually recurring accident. Poverty is the result of a few people taking too much and not behaving as if we are all one. So it's that sense of oneness fundamental to the humanistic tradition, but that sense of oneness, which in a way removes, it does change the argument. It removes this idea of us and them, Indigenous, non-Indigenous, rich, poor, etc. No, we are all this, and some of who we are have a civilization that goes back 60 or 70,000 years and therefore has much to teach us, particularly about management of land and fire, as you mentioned, Gawaine. Others of us have been born into huge disadvantage, and we have much to learn about what that's like, and a responsibility to do what we can to ease the suffering that flows from it. I mean, again, to return to Lou's talk about compassion as being suffering together, that is, I mean, there's a lot of talk about the human condition. That's the human condition. We are suffering together, and some of us can insulate ourselves from it or mask it in some way through wealth or affluence or comfort of some kind, self-indulgence of some kind. But that is denying the truth about us, which is that the body politic, the human condition, the human society is dreadfully unequal. And there's something we need to do about that.
Yeah, Hugh. Lou.
If I may, just to, I feel that we have failed in social action mostly because we demean people by the way in which we help them. And I want to say that we need to stop thinking that person is poor or needy, therefore they need food and clothing because they're needy and poor. And I want to say, no, it isn't that way. They need food because they're human, like me. We all need to eat. They need clothes because, like me, they're human. They need protection from the cold. They need a house. They need shelter. That's just a human thing. When we say, oh, but that's something which belongs to the poor. It reminds me of Shakyamuni when he went out riding, and he saw for the first time sick and old people and death. And he said, well, surely this doesn't happen in every family. This must be something that happens to other people. And the person who's riding with him says, no, I'm sorry, young man. This happens to everybody, and it'll happen to you. And that's where I think, in terms of our feeling of superiority, we need to remind ourselves we all have to eat, have shelter, have clothing, medical care. These are the issues where we share exactly the same needs. And so if we can provide those human needs to everybody, that seems to me to be an equitable society, because we do it because we are all in need of exactly these same issues. Thank you.
There is a wonderful, and to me, for a long time, puzzling story about St. Martin, who was a Roman centurion out riding on his horse one wet and windy day with a nice thick cloak, and there was a beggar beside the road, and he was struck with compassion for the beggar. What he did not do is take off his cloak and give it to the beggar. What he did was he took off his cloak, he cut it in half and gave him half, and they had half each. And I was long puzzled by that, and I realized after a while he'd seen very deeply. Our next question.
Sorry, can I just say it's a very interesting echo of the point that Lou was just making.
Yeah.
That Finland does not have a problem of homelessness. Australia has a problem of homelessness. America has a problem. Many countries do. Finland doesn't. Why not? Because if you haven't got a house to live in, they give you one. You don't have to prove that you deserve it. You don't have to qualify yourself in some way. It's exactly as Lou just expressed it. You get a house because you're a human and you're part of us, and you need shelter. Now, the problems that made you homeless will need to be addressed, but they can't be addressed until you're securely housed. We don't solve the problems first and then decide you're ready for a house. We house you. That's an important part of being equipped to address the problem.
Now, the next question is a slight change of direction. It's from Xiao Yang. Does religion encourage or distract us from this sense of shared humanity? And what do you think Buddhists could contribute? We might go to you, Lou, first on this one, if you wouldn't mind.
Yeah, well, sure. I think what we've been saying, and Hugh has expressed this quite well as well, that, and this is true for the Buddhist tradition in general, and I appreciate what Master Xing Yun often does. He says to people, if you have a really wonderful religious life, good for you, hold on to it. You don't have to come over and embrace my religious life. I remember some years ago that a historian of religion was giving a talk, and a woman raised her hand and she said, Professor, I don't know what you're talking about, because I have accepted my Lord and Master as my Savior, and I have that. And everybody waited for what he would say to her, because he'd been talking about comparative religion. And he said, I am so glad for you. You have found something. You have a tradition. You have something that's good. So I think the first thing is you don't destroy something in order to bring something new, because it's like we just had one of our famous generals passed away, but he once said, if you fight a war and you break it, you own it. And that is the issue that we face. When you move into like with the Aboriginal communities of North America and Australia, to the degree that their social and religious fabric was damaged, to that degree did they suffer, that the people who came in who felt that their religion should replace what was already there made, I think, a fundamental mistake of not standing back and saying, let me really find out what you have. Mm-hmm. Let's find out what you have. And if it's good, good. But I think that for the Buddhists, they make a good message, which is to say, we live in a world where everything changes. We live in a world in which we are faced with how we deal with this constant change and the flux and flow of life. And I believe this is a message that needs to be heard by the world, whether they're Christians, Jews, or whatnot. So I love it when Goldie Hawn calls herself a Jubu, Jewish by heritage and a Buddhist by conversion and interest. So she's a Jubu. Well, that's okay, in my view. Now, I know it's not okay in other people's view. And yet, when you look at some of the societies that are most successful, take China. You can be a Taoist, you can be a Buddhist, and you can be of Confucian in practice at the same time. Taoist practice is for your body, the Confucian practice is for your societal state, and the Buddhist practice is for your thought and your mind. It's pretty good. Suppose the Abrahamic religion said you can be a Jew and a Christian and an Islamicist for different purposes in your life. We say that's impossible. It'll never happen. Anyway, you get the message.
Hugh?
Yes, thank you. I think of this, I mean, there is tension, isn't there, embedded in this question. Tension between institutional religion, which is often about separateness, identity, dogma, doctrine, how we're right, implication you're wrong. I mean, when we say Buddhism, well, what kind of Buddhism? I mean, how many sects are there under the umbrella of Buddhism? If you say Christian, well, how many denominations are there? And within a particular denomination, how many splits have there been, fragmenting into sub-denominations? That's part of how humans behave in a kind of tribal way. And it's a cultural phenomenon that should not blind us. I mean, it's amusing in a way. It's sometimes appallingly destructive because it produces terrible hostility and violence and hatred, animosity, all of that. That's all bad and has to do with the power of an institution. And as soon as a religion becomes institutionalized, it's subject to the corruption that a powerful person is subject to. Institutions are corrupted by power in the same way as individuals are. However, there's tension between that whole story and the story of the faith or the belief or the religious practices of the individual. most people in most Western societies particularly, but perhaps in other societies as well, have become increasingly mistrustful of institutional religion, but continue to admire the individual believer who engages in religious practices of one kind or another. So the whole thing about division, competition, contest, corruption, institution, etc. on one side, on the other side, what is it that makes about 80% of the world's population identify with one religious tradition or another? I suggest it's got very little to do with institutions. It's got very little to do with dogma, doctrine, or the things that cause cults and sects to split and kind of multiply infinitely. I suggest that religion comes into being in every society throughout history as a way of fostering compassion. That does seem to me to be the core idea of religion. That's the heart of the Christian message. If you go to the source documents and read Jesus' Sermon on the Mount, you're going to find a distillation of some thoughts about the need for compassion, which will not be different from the teachings of Buddha or Muhammad or whoever you like. At the core, we create religions in order to reinforce, build up, strengthen, replenish our innate capacity for kindness and compassion towards each other, which can so easily be diminished and corrupted in the rush of daily life, and in particular in our competitiveness, our acquisitiveness, our materialism, and so on. It's a very good thing for a daily or a weekly religious practice to have the effect of reminding us of what it really does mean to be human. And that's inseparable from our responsibility to exercise compassion. So institutions, contests, rivalry, violence, bad. Reinforcement of the compassion message, good.
Well, if people are worried about competition between religions, and they look at the demographics and they look at the studies that are being made, the real competition is not between the religions. It's between religions and no religion. And no religion is growing more rapidly than any religion. When you say that Islam is the fastest growing of the religions, its growth is nothing compared to the number of people who are now saying none of the above. And yet I feel I'm really concerned that the religious traditions have given us so much to remove them from the social scene causes me to wonder what kind of a world will that be like.
The next question builds on this but takes it off in a slightly different angle. And this is from the Venerable Miao Fan from the Guoguangshan Institute of Humanistic Buddhism. While the society is changing tremendously in the modern era, how does one balance economic needs and technological development in terms of mindset and behaviors, while at the same time actualizing the humanistic values? So I have a sense that in this question, there's a pointing to the humanistic values and the values in religion and compassion and so on that we have been talking about, but also putting that alongside the great emphasis on economic need and development and, of course, technological change. So what happens when those things have to occupy the same sphere, the same world, the same minds. Hugh.
Hugh, I think.
Yes.
Yeah, thanks, Gawaine. Well, obviously, both are important. I mean, the story of human progress, loosely defined, is a story of economic development and technological development, as well as the maintenance of the compassion tradition. I think the balance, a way I find helpful for determining the balance is what I think of as the death perspective. By the death perspective, I mean when we're nearly dead, and I'm closer to being nearly dead than you are, but when we're nearly dead, let's say it's we know that it's coming and we're into the last week of our life. There are some things that I can guarantee, based on the literature of death and dying, I can guarantee that none of us at that time will say, I really wish I'd made more money. I really wish I'd finally indulged in that car I'd lusted after for so long. I really wish I'd acquired more stuff. What we are going to say is, was I kind enough? Did I lead a life of compassion? Was I a sufficiently loyal and loving spouse? Was I a sufficiently responsible and loving parent? Was I a good neighbour? Was I fair to my employees, etc.? Now, I think we can take the death perspective into daily life. And this does not mean that we are going to discount the importance of economics or the importance of technology. But I would suggest as a daily discipline, in fact, specifically a nightly discipline, at the end of the day, at the end of each day, to reflect and say, well, how did I get the balance today? Was I kind enough? Was I compassionate enough? Was I loyal enough? Was I loving enough? And to answer those questions, before worrying about whether I made enough money today or whether I should have updated my iPhone or something. I mean, those sort of things are going to happen. The onrush that sweeps us along is the onrush of economics and economic development and technology. What we need is the daily or nightly correction to alert us to the fact that we are in the onrush. And in the midst of all of that, it is our responsibility as members of this species to exercise compassion, to be loyal friends, loving partners, fair employers, etc. We don't have to worry about paying enough attention to economics or technology. It's there. What we have to worry about is paying enough attention to the counterpoint.
So, Buddhism has always been a religion of the merchants. The spread of Buddhism was totally brought about by merchants. So it is not that Buddhism turns its back on that. And in the famous Perfection of Wisdom Sutra, there is a bodhisattva who is shown to be married, has a lot of wealth, and lives a good life. And then the text says, it's okay, so long as he doesn't cling to it. If he can have it and share it and live this good life, there's no reason not to live a good life in that sense. I think that people, I kind of like to hear that part of the Buddhist message, because people say, well, the Buddhists are almost nihilist. You just don't do anything that's fun. You try to put yourself in as, you give up everything. And the Buddhists, not all Buddhists become monks and nuns. They live, as I've said, most Buddhists have lived an economic life as merchants. And we now live in an urban environment. Religion has to be, all religions have to become urban. We can't remain the way it once was, that religion was often rural, dependent on a rural environment and a life. So Venerable Malfon's question is a very good one. And I would just say, from the Buddhist perspective, economics is there from the very beginning. The first great disciple of the Buddha was a merchant. And he gave him a big donation. So it's been okay in Buddhism, and we need to consider very carefully what that real message is, because it's an important one for economics.
So with that, we'll draw this session to a close. And if I might just give a quick personal reflection, I think what's really struck me about this discussion is, first of all, talking about crises and things changing and how do we manage. Actually, the discussion has kept coming back to fundamentals, it seemed to me. Get the fundamentals right. And the fundamentals not being new or different, even though their manifestation may be different as times change. And from you, Lou, the importance of history, just understanding how these things have worked out in human experience so we can be wise in the light of that. And the third thing, the strong emphasis on individual responsibility, the snowflake in the avalanche. Still, snowflake's got a bit that it can manage, and it can at least decide which way up it lands. So for that and many, many more things, thank you both enormously. Thank you also, people who have put in questions, and apologies to those that we didn't get to, but I'm glad we had very thoughtful and considered answers to the ones that we could take up. Professor Lancaster, Hugh Mackay, thank you so much. It's been really inspiring.
Thank you, Colin, for your help.
Yes, here. Thank you.